Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. College football. Where the hell are we? Week 10, I think. I can't keep track anymore. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, have you started applying war paint for one of the biggest games on the college football schedule that the Florida State fan base has to endure every single fall?
It's a big game for the program. I told you coming out of the bye, it was the biggest 5-game stretch in the program since 2013's run to the national championship.
So does that mean you didn't answer the question? Are you putting on face paint? Do you have your horse ready? Do you have a flaming spear? Are you going to try and go out there in a spitting image of Chief Osceola to will in a victory?
Got a horse out back ready, yeah.
That's what I'm talking about.
I'm still debating if I will attend. I'll just figure out how I feel when I wake up.
Yeah, you know what? Hold on a second. Let's peel back the curtain a little bit there. How does it
figure out how I feel?
How does the pain deliberation go? You wake up on the right side of the pillow. You go, "Yep, I'm all in for today." Nope, I'm going to stay at home and I'm going to dive into the NFL card. Is that as simple and straightforward as it looks?
It just. Do I want to get out and deal with other humans, or do I just want to watch this?
Then you're definitely not going. Then that's a no-brainer. You're minus $6 not to go. Yeah,
I'm one of those people that likes to watch important games kind of by themselves. I don't need people that don't know what's going on yammering in my ear.
I mean, that's kind of the way I look at it. I mean, I'd much rather watch games peace and quiet, be able to control the remote, be able to control what I'm drinking and everything else that goes along that way. But a big game that we will, of course, break down later in the show. I just, hoping that you have a spreadsheet of all the Florida State games you've attended that, like Brad does for Notre Dame. But,
he's attended more Dame games than I have Florida State.
I was trying to think. When we went to the...
Not even close.
When we went to the Tennessee-Alabama game, one of my buddies on the trip asked how many college football games I've attended. And I really believe it's like under 15. I'd probably have to sit there and make a list. Not just for one program. That's 15 games in general. And that probably includes 3 to 4 Northwestern games that really don't count because you get there about 10 minutes before kickoff. You can leave midway through the third quarter and realize you're going to beat the traffic. So as a kid, I just used to like to go for the hot dog at Mustard's Last Stand.
Taking shots at one of our loyal Northwestern listeners.
Yeah, but I shout out the hot dog stand for him, so I completely redeemed myself. And he asked for Northwestern breakdowns every week, but when the Wildcats go 1-11, they sure as shit aren't getting a deep dive on this podcast anytime soon. But all right, we got a lot of ground to cover. We have a massive, and I mean absolutely massive matchup in the SEC that'll go a long way in defining the SEC East and the quest for a national championship. So rather than just you and me sitting here yammering away, let's get this show kicked off in style. He joins us every Wednesday throughout the course of the college football season, and you, of course, can follow Brad Powers on Twitter. That's at BradPowers7. And Brad, we have a laundry list of marquee games to get to, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about a little bit of the back and forth that you and Payne had earlier. Clearly a meeting of the minds, not seeing things eye to eye if we got Tennessee to take on Clemson on a neutral field. Do you guys want to hash out some of your philosophical differences before we dive into the marquee games of this weekend's slate?
Well, Payne just, put out a bad number. And when you see bad numbers, you let people know, either, on Twitter or, money. And he said his line between Tennessee and Clemson, Tennessee minus 2.5, lay 120. He thought he was being clever with that, extra juice there on the favorite.
I'm luring Brad in.
And I said, I don't care about that extra juice. You're way off. I mean, I'd blow through a key number there, no problem. I'd make it 4.5. So max bet Tennessee.
So what happens, and mind you, this hypothetical line isn't available to actually bet. I don't do look-ahead lines here. But let's say...
We save those for Mondays in the National Football League instead.
Let's say Georgia rolls, and Clemson beats your beloved Notre Dame this weekend. Are you going to feel good about where you have things?
Yeah, so
I'm just trying to get ahead.
Yeah, and you did mention that immediately. So, as always, you're pretty sharp, and you're kind of a step ahead of things. I still would make the bet, but I'm guessing I would be closer to 3, and laying 2.5 with extra juice it wouldn't be as obviously as advantageous as what I was thinking at the moment when I sent that tweet out.
And how do you feel about social media just piling on saying Tennessee should be a 10-point favorite over Clemson or even a 14-point favorite? Do you feel good aligning yourself with those folks?
It did not make me feel better. Anytime I'm with the Barney at the bar types, I'm in trouble.
Oh, good times. And, of course, we don't talk in hypotheticals around here. Payne, I'm going to do you a favor. We're not even going to mention the first unveiling of the college football playoff rankings because those things are going to get thrown into complete upheaval with some of the marquee.
It's just theater
exactly.
at this point.
It's a reality TV show meant to generate
it's theater,
headlines.
the first one, yes. Absolutely.
So no reason to dive into that. I know you'll be a little bit disappointed because you love to talk about things that are never going to materialize on a field that we can actually bet on. So let's get right into one of the games that we have on the schedule to break down today. And ironically enough, Payne, this was a game that Brad got into, or I shouldn't say a game, involves a team that Brad got into a little back and forth before the season even started, with the NC State Wolfpack at home playing host to the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. You're looking at Wake right around a 4.5 point road favorite. Total on this game sits at 54. A 130-year-old game that's been played for 115 consecutive games against two programs. Second largest standing rivalry in the entire country. Homecoming at Carter Finley Stadium. When you look at Wake, they've won 4 out of the last 5 against NC State. The last 2 meetings have finished with a boatload of points on the scoreboard. When you look at NC State, they're apparently one of the more overvalued teams this season for odds makers. 1-6 ATS against FBS opponents. Meanwhile, you look at NC State, and Payne, something you brought up in the past, this is one of the more underrated home field advantages within the Power 5 conferences, and it's suggested by how well NC State has played in their own building. A 15-game home winning streak dating back to 2020, the 6th longest active home win streak in all of the FBS. NC State's largest home win streak in school history is 16, came in 1972 to 1975, and in 6 degrees of separation for Notre Dame in the college football world. Lou Holtz was their head coach then. Brad, I guess when you kick off the handicap in this, we saw what Wake Forest did last Saturday against Louisville. Turned the ball over 8 times, arguably one of the worst third quarters that I've ever seen played by a team inside the top 15. How do you go about normalizing a box score for that kind of game, knowing a team that was in the top 5 in turnover differential in the ACC ain't going to turn the football over 8 times in this game, maybe not over the course of the remainder of the month of November?
It's a good question. It's the question. I think it's one of 2 questions as far as the handicap of this game. Certainly for the Wake Forest side, you can scream outlier. I'll say this, though. Sam Hartman usually has one of these games a year where when it rains, it pours when it comes to turnovers. I mean, in 40 career starts, he's got 20 turnovers in 5 games. The other 35 starts, 22. So he doesn't turn the football over, but you go back to the ACC championship game a year ago, the bowl game against Wisconsin a couple years ago. He's very capable of going on a stretch where he has 3, 4, 5 turnovers in a 4 or 5 possession type of stretch. So I bet against Wake Forest last week. They're up by 1 at halftime. I wasn't feeling extremely confident about Louisville at that point. I thought Wake Forest at that point had exceeded my expectations. So I chalk it up as one bad quarter. And I got to tell you, when the lines are tighter this time of the year, I'm looking for outliers, overreactions, and just stuff that, is totally out of the realm of, normalcy. And a 35-0 getting outscored third quarter with 6 turnovers by Wake Forest certainly screams that I want to play on that team the very next week.
So you mentioned outliers, and Payne, I'll flip the script to you. When you try and go through the box scores and make your adjustments as well, trying to figure out not just the Wake Forest side, but also another part of the handicap, and Brad will come back to you after, about an NC State team that looked to be stuck in quicksand for the first half at home against Virginia Tech. You're right around a 2-touchdown favorite, can't do anything offensively. Suddenly they pull Jack Chambers from the game. MJ Morris steps in. He finishes 20 of 29 with 200 665 passing yards and 3 touchdowns in the first real action of his college career. How do you go about factoring all of those things in to even set a baseline number when you're handicapping this game?
Yeah, a lot of moving parts, and sometimes that's to the advantage of the bettor. More uncertainty. And there's a reason this opened Wake Forest 3, and we're now sitting at 4.5. Give Louisville all the credit in the world for upsetting Wake last week. They were actually better down to down in yards per play, success rate. They were even a little bit more explosive before we even get into the turnovers that Brad mentioned. But 8 turnovers? 8? And based on how each play unfolded, Wake was only expected to turn it over 3 times. So there is this idea of buying low on Wake this week and knowing how Wake recruits. They win games by being buttoned up. And last week is very unlike most Dave Clawson-led Deeks teams, right? You just don't really see that. Now, Brad mentioned Hartman has these kerfluffles from time to time, but in general, they win by being buttoned up. You also have history in this series. Tony Gibson's been the defensive coordinator at NC State the past 3 seasons. He's faced this corky mesh point Wake Forest offense. NC State's had trouble defending it. I mean, Wake scored 124 offensive points the last 3 meetings. The most was 45 last season. That was the best defensive unit the Wolfpack have had, and God knows how long. They finished 14th in schedule-adjusted defensive efficiency. So Wake has had some real success in this meeting. I don't know where we go from here. The market hit 5 a couple places. We're back to basically 4 is the consensus number. I don't think there's a shot of getting to 6 or 7. My feeling is if it did, there might be a little bit of a different sentiment based upon what you had just said, and that's MJ Morris, the 4-star freshman from Carrollton, Georgia. He was rated the 25th best quarterback in the 2022 class. He came in after Dave Dorn had seen enough of Chambers. I'm surprised it really took that long. Candidly,
I saw enough of Chambers after 2 drives against Syracuse. Let's not sugarcoat any of what the Coastal Carolina, what the Charleston Southern transfer brought in once Devin Leary went down. But go ahead, I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah, I appreciate you not mentioning.
No, I conveniently left that out. We'll pick on Florida State later in the show. Don't worry about it.
So I mean, MJ Morris came in. He led the 3 touchdown drives to beat Virginia Tech. Now, is it a positive in that moment? Yes. Is it good to see MJ Morris get his feet wet? Yes. But now you do have some film on him.
Yep.
So let's see what that looks like. I think we respect the upgrade Wake Forest has made defensively in terms of coordinator, the mind, right? Like there's just not a ton of great talent on Wake Forest defense, but schematically it looks a little bit better this year. I just don't know what we're looking at here. Now, the defense hasn't been great by any stretch. They're still outside the top 80 in both schedule-adjusted EPA per rush and pass for the Demon Deacons. I look at this, and it's weird. And even as we're recording right now, Chris is coming from 54 to 53.5. I'll let you guys finish this in any direction you'd like, but based on the recent series history and MJ Morris, regardless if Wake is prepared for him, the far more competent thrower. What do you make of this total?
Yeah, Brad, I think that's a perfect question. We can throw your direction. One thing I wanted to, mention, Payne, when you talk about Wake and how NC State struggled with the mesh point. I wonder about this ground game. I think for me, when I look at Wake Forest, that's been the most disappointing part of their offense this season. We really haven't seen those big rushing games from Justice Ellison and Christian Turner. I look back over their schedule. I feel like we only saw that against Clemson when they were playing a bunch of UPS drivers on the outside against A.T. Perry and Donovan Green. But Brad, when you look at the total and you look at the adjustments that NC State has made at quarterback, how have you gone about kind of changing your handicap and adjusting your numbers on this?
So I bet the under on the open. It was 57.5. Just thought it was too high from what I've seen from NC State, even considering that the freshman Morris looked like a significant upgrade over Chambers. But with that being said, it kind of has some confliction there because I also laid it with Wake Forest, and you would think a total in the mid to, trending to lower 50s would play more into the hands of NC State, the style that they want to play to compete in this game. So I get why Payne's bringing that up and questioning, what do you think of the total? Because recent past history, when you have the same 2 coaches say shootout, And if I'm liking Wake Forest, obviously I'm expecting them to do what they've been doing to NC State defensively. So I get that confliction. For me, I don't have time to think about that on a Sunday. That's why I do this podcast on a Wednesday. Now it's getting to the point where I wouldn't mind buying back a little bit on the over because, I do expect Wake Forest to have success offensively. One thing I will bring up is when you're looking for any type of edges, I mean, people just remember results sometimes this time of year. They don't remember what actually went into the games. And I do want to say that NC State, when you look at post-game win expectancy, most fortunate team in the country. I mean, they have 6 wins. Post-game win expectancy says 3.8. So that's another reason why I was trending more towards the Wake Forest side. Not just buy low spot after last week, but more of a sell-off of an NC State team that I think is generally overrated.
I mean, we aren't the biggest Dave Doran fans around these parts, so can understand those sentiments. Should be one hell of a game to see unfold Saturday night. Obviously, both these teams had expectations of potentially winning the conference. Those seem to be dashed as Clemson remains 1 win away from sealing up that side of the division, but it doesn't make this rivalry lose any bit of the luster that we'll see there. All right, from one ACC rivalry to another, and this one may be a lot closer to the heartstrings of one of our esteemed analysts around these parts. So, Brad, while normally we allow you to do the honors, we're going to let Payne kick this one off, and that, of course, is Florida State's trip down to Hard Rock Stadium to take on the Miami Hurricanes. You're looking at Florida State. We'll call them a 7.5-point consensus favorite on this game, up a touch from where we saw it open at the key of 7. The total up nearly a touchdown at some shops out here in the desert, but 53.5 more or less the prevailing number. Second time all year, Payne, that Miami gets installed as an underdog in a football game. It obviously changes the dynamic for a team that's underachieved all season long. Last year's win for Florida State ended a 4-game cover streak for the Canes in the rivalry, and you read into some of the comments and the quotes coming out of South Florida. Mario Cristobal, I'm preparing for Florida State, pretty much said, you signed up to play certain schools in certain games, and this is one of them. Meanwhile, at the same time, the Miami Herald putting out an article calling for Miami fans to actually show up and come out to support their program, something that we haven't seen. You're a lot closer to this rivalry than I've ever been, than Brad's ever been. Lay out some of the dynamics that take place every Saturday in November when Florida State takes on Miami.
I think that's ultimately the tricky part about this when you're looking at the spread. I mean, we saw Florida State without a prayer in the world to beat Miami last year, and they went and did it. And this ultimately is Miami's Super Bowl at this point. Fortunately, they got a win last week against Virginia, or else they were going to be, and I think they still are, very much on the outside looking in to a bowl game. So this ultimately is their Super Bowl. The matchup isn't great for Miami on paper. Let's see what Tyler Van Dyke does in this game. All signs are starting to trend towards him potentially playing. When I look at some of these matchups, you've seen defenses start to give Florida State different looks from about the Louisville game onwards. They're forcing Florida State to drive the field, partly because if you look at film, the Noles offensive line has tended to crumble at some point, either in blocking or they'll commit a penalty, partly because they realized FSU didn't have trust in its kicker at one point. And so they wanted Florida State to methodically move the ball and get some stops in their own territory. And that's how teams are really defending them. It's changed a little bit because FSU now leads the country in drives of 80-plus yards. So they've shown the ability at times to be competent down to down. But the key here is Florida State's been wildly explosive. Top 10 in schedule-adjusted explosiveness. And those big plays have come on the ground. They've come through the air. Miami's defense has been very good down to down. Their front is the best part of the entire team. They create a ton of havoc, top 5 in the country. They punish the quarterback in known passing situations, so top 20 in passing down sack rate. But you can absolutely gash the Canes defense through the air. They're outside the top 100 in both explosive pass defense and yards per pass attempt allowed. So I think that's kind of where the variance lies within this game is if FSU can keep Jordan Travis upright, there's going to be some plays to be had downfield. And boy, like you're looking at the FSU receiver room, it is deep. One offseason in the transfer portal has changed a ton. Right now, FSU's graded out the 4th best receiver group in the country. They're 95th last season. And that ultimately is going to be the game within the game. If you can keep Jordan Travis upright, there's going to be a ton of plays for Florida State to be able to make in this game. Aside from blocking well, there are some ways to negate Miami's ability to get pressure, and we started to see that more in recent weeks. I've been wondering where it's been. We saw flashes of it a year ago at Clemson. Lawrence Toafili catching the ball in the backfield. He's just an absolute nightmare matchup, especially for the linebackers that Miami has. It is a poor group to begin with. They're a little dinged up. I also think Norvell's held some things back. Gained 700 yards last week against Georgia Tech, but what didn't we actually see? Not a single designed run from Jordan Travis. And I think in a high leverage game like this, that's going to be the key to unlocking a little bit more of the green and red zone efficiency that Florida State struggled in a little bit. They're outside the top 70 in points per trip inside the 40. I think you're going to see his legs go a little bit more this week. The other thing here is the two teams are polar opposites in strength of schedule. FSU's faced a borderline top 10 schedule. Some respected bettors that I speak with have Miami's strength of schedule outside the top 75. And you look at some of these wins that Miami's had: Bethune, Southern Miss, Vatech, and UVA. I think the scary part last week is Miami's a winner by 2 on the scoreboard after 4 overtimes. They're a 7-point loser in the advanced box score. So had they not luck boxed their way to a win, I don't think they were sniffing a bowl game. I do, again, expect this to be Miami's Super Bowl. I think they're going to come initially with a ton of energy and effort. So we have to see Florida State come out strong. Just punch them in the mouth to begin with. You can't have a start like you had it, against Georgia Tech last week. You kind of want to dash their hopes early on, and I do think there's more pressure on Florida State here, right? It's year 3 of Mike Norvell. You can easily chalk up year 1 for Mario Cristobal, especially with the recruiting class that he has coming in, and just kind of easily, throw that by the wayside. Tyler Van Dyke, I talked to Brad a little bit last night. He's been throwing. It's obviously a shoulder injury. He did travel to Virginia last week. He was back at practice on Sunday throwing a little bit. There was this interesting comment from Josh Gaddis on Tuesday. He said, "We're not going to take any shortcuts. We're going to make sure everyone's 100% healthy." Maybe I'm overthinking this, but if you play Garcia or Ja'Cory and lose, all right, it's year 1. Your starting quarterback was out. You can sell our starting quarterback was out to recruits. But if Van Dyke plays and you get beat soundly, it's a little bit of a different story. And the other thing here that's intriguing before I kind of wrap this up, we saw Miami throw a little bit of a Hail Mary last week to try and fix things. It was pretty subtle if you haven't paid attention, but the offensive coordinator, who we told you was a bust to begin with, and Josh Gaddis, moved from the coach's box to the sideline against Virginia. And Gaddis had a quote this week about the move. He said it was really a rallying moment of just being able to instill some confidence, being able to talk and get communication on the sideline. When you're up in the box and you see adversity happen, you really feel like there's nothing you can do to help ease that moment. And so I thought it was important for me to be down there. The move down onto the field for Josh Gaddis helped Miami's offense average 3.9 yards per play, a 5% explosive play rate, and they ended up with a grand total of 14 points in 4 overtimes. I don't know what I'm seeing here. It's really bad in terms of preparation and execution. Maybe Tyler Van Dyke helps that. There's also a couple guys in the receiving group. I know Restrepo's been kind of targeting this game to come back. If you can get Van Dyke and you can get the 2 leading receivers you projected back at the beginning of the season, maybe this is a little bit more competitive. Again, this has been a little bit of a wonky season, but metrically, along with some of the reading, you can see why FSU at 7 was hit a little bit here. I just haven't gotten myself to the
tactical advantages in a variety of spots. And what's interesting when you dig into some of Miami's numbers, you brought up that strength of schedule. They get even worse if you back out some of their opponents as far as points per game. They're 101st in the country, but against the Power 5, 17 points per game. Miami hasn't scored a rushing touchdown against the Power 5 team yet this season. 36% conversion rate on 3rd downs. I mean, defensively, they're not much better. And when you've allowed the most touchdown or most pass plays of 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80 yards in the ACC, not a ringing endorsement for what they are defensively. So we'll come full circle, Brad. We'll remove some of the emotion and the level of depth and knowledge that Payne has of both of these particular programs and look at just the number and some of the upgrades and downgrades that you've made to these teams and where you've arrived for this particular Saturday.
Yeah, so we'll start with Florida State. I have the Noles up to number 16 in my power ratings. I've upgraded them 3.5 points since the start of the season. I like what I see, and if people are listening out there, how can you have Florida State with 3 losses, number 16 in your power ratings? I mean, again, they easily could have been 6-2, maybe 7-1. Obviously, should have won the NC State game. I thought a lot of people were going to point towards the Clemson game and say that, Florida State, a couple of garbage touchdowns to make that more respectable. That's not the game I saw. I saw Florida State move the football all game long, and it was really the last 2 minutes of the first half and the first 2 minutes of the second half where Clemson got margin. Almost all their margin was in that 4-minute period. So I've been more impressed with Florida State than at least the odds makers. I mean, you're talking about a team that's number 6 in the country in yards per play margin, and as Payne mentioned, has played a very respectable, tough schedule so far this season. So, I mean, that's really good numbers there for the Noles. On the other side, obviously significant downgrade for Miami. I mean, I downgraded them 13 points since the start of the season, as much as pretty much any team in the country, especially, with regarding, I know if Van Dyke comes back, maybe there's a little bit of an upgrade there, but not much. You mentioned, you take out some of their stats against poor opponents. Just take out the opener against an FCS opponent, a bad FCS team, Bethune-Cookman. Miami hasn't covered a game all season against FBS competition, and they're failing to cover by 13 points per game. And I would say by this time in the season, you normally pay a premium if you want to fade a team like that hasn't covered. I don't see that in the market, or at least my power ratings. So, and maybe it's because Miami's a very public team, and they still have talent there, and Mario's in the news with recruits. But I thought Payne was pretty kind. He had a lot of ifs there. Well, if Tyler Van Dyke can play, and if the wide receivers come back, and if, and what I'm getting at is I'm part of the FSU money here at 7, and I would still lay 7.5.
It's so interesting because you look at Miami, and despite their on-field performance, it hasn't really hurt them yet, and the key being yet on the recruiting trail as they land a marquee prospect at defensive back. We'll see if this continues and Miami ends up missing the postseason, what it actually does to them by the time they reconvene for spring camp. But no doubt, when you look at two programs that had high expectations coming into the year, one with conference championship aspirations, not quite going to get realized, but Miami can salvage something if they're able to pull off the outright upset against Florida State on Saturday. From the ACC, gents, let's head to Big 12 country, and it's the Baylor Bears going on the road to Norman to take on the Oklahoma Sooners. Oklahoma, slightly more than a field goal favorite here at 3.5. Total on the game sits at 58, and this will be the first time these two teams have met while both are outside the top 25 since 2005, when the Sooners beat the Bears 37-30 in double overtime at Floyd Casey Stadium. When you look at Baylor, despite some of their struggles early on this year, still very much in control of their own conference destiny. They'll finish at Oklahoma, home against Kansas State, home against TCU, and the final game of their regular season on the road in Austin against the Texas Longhorns. Brad, we've talked about Oklahoma. This is a team that's been up and down. I'm not sure that they've solved all of what ails them on the defensive side of the ball, but Iowa State, the perfect cure-all for that, because the Cyclones flat out can't run the football, yet Oklahoma needed an interception and a late touchdown to find that comfortable level of separation. When you begin to assess these teams here, we know there's a high level of familiarity between Dave Aranda and Jeff Lebby. They met in a bowl game, but in terms of overall power numbers, how have these teams been moving throughout the course of their first 8 games of the year?
Yeah, so Baylor's flat for me. I have number 18 in my power rings right now. If that sounds a little high, again, just your basic metrics. They're in the top 25 in yards per play margin, yards per game margin, points per game margin. Played a relatively respectable schedule. Probably could easily be better than their record. I mean, I hate to bring up the BYU game. That could have gone either way. I'm not sure that they lose to West Virginia if Shapen, the quarterback, doesn't get hurt in that game. They were moving the football at will. So I'm flat there. Oklahoma, obviously downgrade. I've downgraded them about 5 points. But, I mean, most of their, when you look at their statistical outliers, it was without Dylan Gabriel at quarterback. And probably a little bit of a hidden factor, and you guys have brought this up in past podcasts, is on the defense side of the ball. The quarterback of the defense, Billy Bowman, missed a few games. And Oklahoma doesn't have as much depth as what they had there. I'm dating myself, but go back to early Bob Stoops. I mean, losing a guy like that on defense was devastating to a first-year team trying to understand brand new schemes. And they did get him back. He was probably part of the reason why they were able to hold Iowa State, although you mentioned it, Todd. I mean, they still got outgained. They benefited from a plus couple turnover margin in that one. This is the game where we're going to find out if Oklahoma can at least make some run towards respectability towards the end of the season and maybe flirt with, an 8-4, maybe 9-3, obviously at absolute best record. I'm not there yet. One game, and then obviously the Kansas game offensively, they looked apart, but I'm not there yet. And, I'm more along the lines that, Baylor, I think, maybe still flying a little bit under the radar here.
Yeah, you mentioned Bowman. He, of course, did return last week against Iowa State, played 44 snaps, and some of the Oklahoma folks said that they saw Woody Washington play his best football of the season as a result. So getting healthy in the defensive backfield, lining this team up, should be able to pay dividends, but there still are, to your point, Brad, some red flags for Oklahoma's overall performances, with a run defense giving up a shade less than 190 yards per game, the worst mark in the Big 12, and you look at some of the rushing totals that they've allowed, 165 against Kansas. Why that's a red flag is because Oklahoma played from a positive gain script, and you thought Kansas was going to have to throw the football when they were trailing by multiple scores to get back into it. We know what Texas did, churning out nearly 300 yards on the ground. TCU did churn out 300-plus yards on the ground, and Kansas State rolled up 275. Payne, when you try and assess one particular matchup that you think is going to define the handicap of this game Saturday afternoon in Norman, what are you looking for? Is it the Baylor offense, their ability to run the football against this Oklahoma defense, or the kind of matching of the minds that we're going to see from Dave Aranda against Jeff Lebby if he's able to clamp down like Baylor did in the Sugar Bowl last year when Lebby was calling the plays at Ole Miss?
You did mention that. Unfortunately, Luke Altmaier was the majority
True,
of that
Matt
sample.
Corral went out in that game real early.
Win Yeah. I think you guys actually were on the right path there, and why this game, I think, is one of the toughest on the board to assess, because you see that line at 3.5. And I think it's very easy to gravitate towards Baylor there. That willingness. You see the hook, and you're like, hey, okay. But for me, Baylor's played two ranked teams at the time of the game, and they've lost both. And yes, they had a quarterback injury, but you still lost to West Virginia. The wins are Albany and Texas State. They don't do anything for me. Iowa State is down. Kansas is a great story, but I think we mentioned how fraudulent they were relative to market before they ever dropped the game. And last week, Baylor was the beneficiary of 5 Texas Tech turnovers. They were expected to have 1.1. You beat Texas Tech by 28 on the scoreboard. It was really just 12 in the advanced box score. And I don't think it's shocking that Dave Aranda made quick work of an inexperienced freshman quarterback, because we've seen it happen numerous times, especially last year, to a kid named Caleb Williams. So that, to me, wasn't as impressive as what the scoreboard indicated. And on the flip side, Brad mentioned this perfectly. It's like you have to make manual adjustments to the Sooners on both sides of the ball. I would completely remove 7 quarters of data without Dylan Gabriel from your numbers, because we know the backup is so bad that in a game where they're trailing by 3 or 4 scores, they're still playing Wildcat. Okay, so I would scrub the final 3 quarters against TCU and all 4 quarters against Texas from that 8-game sample. And when you do, this line makes a hell of a lot more sense. Now, the biggest matchup advantage on paper you outlined, it belongs to Baylor. And that's why I think it's easy to gravitate towards taking the 3.5 perceptually. And the Sooners have to man up in the trenches on the defensive side of the ball. Right now, Baylor top 15 in schedule-adjusted rush efficiency, top 30 in rushing success rate. Sooners have been bullied there. They're outside the top 70 in EPA per rush allowed, rushing success rate allowed. We're 10 weeks into the college football season. When I look at this game and I break it down, this might be the one where I potentially have the least feel for, just because the number to me, again, we just look at market indicators. If Baylor were the side here, I don't think it's 3.5. And that's ultimately what's kept me off that side, despite the biggest matchup advantage in this game going to the way of Baylor.
Hey, it's always a combination of factors, especially when you get to this juncture of the season. I mean, you guys both outlined some of the quarters that have to be removed that impact both positively and negatively the overall data set that you're looking at for Baylor's body of work versus Oklahoma, what the market has responded. And I guess it bears watching to try and see where that next move comes in, if it moves from 3.5 to 4, or if the hooks start to disappear as limits expand a little bit later in the week. For two teams who no doubt, pride themselves on winning conference championships, not just fighting for bowl eligibility. We know they'll both be playing in the postseason, but can one of them crash the conference championship party? That remains to be seen. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You, of course, can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me on social media. And most importantly, as always, follow the Bet the Board podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Plenty of great content there, not only the National Football League and college football, but another episode of Cardboard Chat dropped earlier this week for those folks who may have an interest in how to get into investing in sports cards, memorabilia, etc. It is the perfect place with the Bet the Board stamp of approval. Payne does an outstanding job with minority owner Jesse Craig of PWCC. So if you haven't checked that out, I encourage you to get on that. This is the time of the show, gentlemen, where we diverge a little bit from Power Conference football and we go off the beaten path. I know a lot of our listeners are sitting there going, what the hell is going on? You guys haven't talked about the biggest game not only of this weekend, but of the entire college football schedule. Don't worry, we will get there. But Brad, as far as the non-Powers 5 game this week, where are you taking us with some of our trials, tribulations, and travels?
We're going down to Texas, AAC. Nice little matchup here. Gonna go and take a look at SMU against Houston here, and we're gonna say lay the 3 here with the home favorite SMU. Reason being, several here, but the basic 101. SMU's played the tougher schedule, better in yards per play margin, yards per game margin, points per game margin, all superior to Houston, and yet they're at home laying 3. So why is it 3 is my question. Well, I think SMU's actually been a little bit better as far as the stats, or at least the final scores. They've given up a couple of late scores against Navy, Tulsa last week. And considering the fact that they were playing with a third-string quarterback for a lot of that game last week against Tulsa and still easily won and covered, screams some value. Tanner Mordecai is back. And I think maybe that's the number one reason why this one is still 3, but I don't anticipate it to close 3. Is I'm not sure that the news is fully out there that Tanner Mordecai is going to be 100% totally back this week. I'm not sure that that's hit the big syndicate betting groups at this point. And then on the other side, I mean, I look at a Houston team that obviously has turned their season around. That final 5-6 minutes against Memphis, certainly gave them some optimism. But then they have an extra week to prep for Navy, take care of business there. I'm not too impressed by that. And then last week they faced a backup quarterback in South Florida, actually a guy that was third string coming into the season. And, South Florida still goes up and down the field on them. So anytime you can get involved going against Dana Holgorsen, I think you're okay. I think it's positive EV. So I'm going to take a look here at SMU -3 this week.
Brad, you mentioned the change in quarterback, and of course, Preston Stone started last week. A little bit of a different wrinkle that he provides. Kevin Jennings comes in, filled in admirably in protecting that lead. But I wanted to ask you about one playmaker on the SMU side. And I thought it was an interesting nugget through the course of the week, doing some diving into the SMU Tulsa game. Rashee Rice talking about how he was going to put a new insole in, said he felt a little bit better dealing with that toe injury. The numbers 9 for 180. You watch these games as close as anybody. Did you see the burst from Rice that we had expected for one of the elite wide receivers in the AAC last week when you watched that game?
Did, and looked like more of the receiver that we saw at the start of the season before he had that 2-3 game sample size where he didn't look like one of the top 5-10. As far as explosiveness, I'm not saying it translates necessarily to he's going to be a high draft pick at the NFL level, but as far as college production, he looked like what he did the first few weeks of the season. So another value point. Now, I mean, what is he worth to a point spread? It's not 1 point, but it's probably in between a quarter point, half point, and when you're dealing again right around a key number of 3, anything coming off of that key number that leads you to the direction you want to bet is pretty significant, at least more significant than other numbers right around that area.
Payne, you want to pile on to Dana in any capacity before we move on?
It doesn't take much for me to want to fade Dana Holgerson. It's just not shocking that he operates some of the least buttoned up teams in the country when a man chooses to wear his hair like that. I mean, trim it up. Take it down a notch. Just let it go. I mean, he's out here just frizzing all over the place. I think, Brad is pretty astute with this. And, you add that layer with SMU's quarterback and captain Tanner Mordecai returning, it makes a ton of sense. And we've also seen SMU's offensive line really do a good job getting pushed this season. They don't allow a lot of negative plays to be created. So I think SMU's O-line has a nice edge against Houston's defensive line. I think that allows the Mustangs to have some relative success on the ground, because you look at Houston, Brad referenced USF going up and down the field. It's because Houston's outside the top 100 in schedule-adjusted rushing success rate and EPA per rush allowed. So most offenses have the ability to be balanced against Houston. Haven't bet it myself, but I do expect this to close higher than current market, and I think Brad maybe have sold me on this one, so I may be betting SMU myself.
Always good to try and find some of those gems for teams that are undervalued lying in the non-Power 5 conferences. We're curious to see where this number continues to trend once it's more widely understood that Tanner Mordecai will assume the reins as starting quarterback for this SMU offense. All right, from the AAC, we go to some big boy football, and over the next 3 games that we'll break down, 2 of them or 3 of them potentially could have massive implications as far as what the college football playoff and chase to the national championship will continue to look like. So we'll start things in Athens, Georgia, where it's the Georgia Bulldogs welcoming in the Tennessee Volunteers. And this number anywhere from 7.5 on the low end, upwards of 8.5. Total sits at 66 to 66.5. 53rd ever 1 versus 2 matchup in the history of the AP poll. The first one since number 1 LSU won at number 2 Alabama, 46 to 41 back in 2019. Third straight number 1 versus number 2 involving a pair of SEC teams. And the last time these teams met in a top 10 matchup, well, that came October 12th, 2002. When you look at Tennessee, we know they're number 1 in the College Football Playoff Committee rankings, the highest rank in the AP poll, number 2 since December 2nd, 2001, after defeating then number 5 Florida before the SEC championship game. When you look at Georgia, they're 5-5 versus the AP poll top 5 opponents under head coach Kirby Smart, but they have won 3 of the last 4, including both wins in the College Football Playoff coming against Michigan and Alabama last season. A little bit of a contrast in styles. Tennessee 5-3 to the over this year, 70.4 total points per game, the 5th highest in the FBS. The over in Knoxville, 15-6 since Josh Heupel took over. It's the 3rd highest over percentage at a shade more than 71% in the FBS since last season. Georgia, meanwhile, under 6-2 this season. Their games average a shade more than 52 points per game. What's interesting about that, though, if you look at just the yard per game stats, I think a lot of people would be surprised where Georgia ranks inside the top 3. Brad, as far as overall power numbers are concerned, I can't imagine there's been much change to Georgia given their overall body of work, but we know Tennessee has been one of the biggest risers. We talked a little bit about it last week against Kentucky. How large an adjustment have you made for the Vols since where they started the season?
8 points. So since the start of the season. Might actually sound a little light, but keep in mind I had Tennessee coming into the season borderline top 10 team. I was involved in a lot of positions, Tennessee in the summer, not only season win total, futures markets, Heisman market for Hooker. So I was probably a little bit higher in the market to begin with, but still an 8-point plus upgrade. And probably considering where this line is right now and where my power ratings are for this particular game, case could be made that I'm a little light in that upgrade.
Well, you mentioned the number here, and I think that's probably the best place to start. So, Payne, I'll go to you with perspective on this, kind of building on what Brad said. You float out some of these things through social media. You talk to odds makers. You know the kind of liability that they're saying could accumulate, especially on the money line here. People believe that this number is way too tall a task, with Georgia more than a touchdown favorite. And when I say people, I mean recreational bettors and folks in the media more than anybody else. But how quickly we forget that it was only a few short weeks ago in the middle of October that we saw Alabama take professional money on the road, and that number closed with Alabama a 9.5-point road favorite at Neyland Stadium. Now, I know Alabama didn't win that football game, but how much different is this number if there's no pass interference call in the end zone, and Alabama ends up going up 2 scores with about 4.5 to 5 minutes to play in a game that Tennessee defined as one of the biggest their program has played in quite some time?
Yeah, and we can get to the matchups in a little bit, but I think from a pure powers number, I show some value to Georgia, but my instincts are that Georgia's defense might be a tick overrated, so that's made me a little bit nervous. I think in general, it's impossible not to love Tennessee's offense, and that's really what's attractive to the casual bettor. Now, obviously, it's very important in terms of gauging these teams, and offense is far more valuable than defense in the year 2022, and the ability to get out and build the lead is extremely valuable. But Tennessee isn't perfect. I could have lost at Pittsburgh to backup quarterback Nick Patty. And you referenced the game we were at. I mean, despite getting out to an 18-point lead and winning the turnover battle and having 103,000 rowdy fans in your corner, and Alabama having 17 penalties for 130 yards, the Vols are trailing by 7 late in that game, and it requires the phantom pass interference call to win. I'm interested to see how the betting market responds to all the Tennessee action as game day approaches. Is this the spot where odds makers decide to take a stance? Or are they going to need to move this down to the key of 7? And if we see 7, is that where pro bettors decide to take a stance of their own and enter the market on Georgia? And my vibe would be, from what I'm hearing, yes.
When you look at some of the matchups that we're going to see play out come Saturday, and you mentioned it, Tennessee's offense grabs all the headlines. Hendon Hooker is the favorite now to win the Heisman at a lot of shops throughout the betting market, and rightfully so. When you look at the numbers he's put forth, the chemistry he's continued to build with Jalen Hyatt, they get another weapon back in Cedric Tillman, who was lightly used last week against Kentucky, but credit to Tennessee offensively, they made sure that Cedric Tillman got his hands on the football early, extending drives, and while he wasn't the deep threat that we've grown accustomed to, they said there'll be no limitations there. Brad, as far as Georgia devising a defensive game plan, we know Nolan Smith lost for the season, but is this Georgia defense underwhelmed, I guess? And that's probably too strong a word, but as far as their overall body of work, the numbers are as good as last year, but to the eye test, they don't feel nearly as explosive, nearly as dominant as what we saw in the run to the national championship.
Agree. Specifically pass rush up front. I mean, this is a team that only has 10 sacks so far this season, and your leading sack guy, Nolan Smith, now out for the season. He has 3 of those 10 sacks. They've been banged up. Jalen Carter, they're outstanding. I mean, arguably coming in this season, the expectation was he was going to be the best defensive lineman in the country. He missed several games. He returned last week, limited role. Expectation is maybe his role increases a little bit this week, but he's still going to be on a snap count. A lot of people I think are going to overreact to Nolan Smith being out. Robert Bill's played more snaps than him this season. Robert Bill was their leading sack guy a year ago, so that didn't, impact me as far as the point spread too much. I go back to Payne's overall point. I'm not really sure how good they are, just because they haven't faced a ton of quality offenses. And I know people are going to point towards, well, they faced Oregon's offense, and look at what they did in the opener. The key word there being the opener, with a brand new scheme, a transfer quarterback, and Oregon moved the football more than 3 points on the scoreboard, meaning that they moved the football up and down the field, probably should have had maybe even 2 more touchdowns on the board against Georgia's defense. So here we are, we're in November, and just because of a lack of strength of schedule of opposing offenses, I'm not sure. I mean, I know that Georgia isn't as good as last year. I just don't know how big of a downgrade is. We're going to find out on Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, this Georgia defense, they've allowed 16 touchdowns in 20 regular season games since the start of 2021. No other FBS team has allowed fewer than 35. So it's tough to kind of put that in perspective. And when you look at a points per game standpoint, something I never thought we were going to say coming into the year, Georgia second in that department behind only the vaunted Fighting Illini. When we look at Alabama and their struggles, Payne, against Tennessee, they didn't blitz the Vols often when the two teams met early. They did so on just 5% of the dropbacks. They put their defensive backs on an island and thought they were going to be able to generate natural pressure with Will Anderson. That strategy obviously failed comically. We saw Tennessee receivers run wide open. Hendon Hooker threw for 385 yards and 5 touchdowns. Kirby Smart is no dummy. He knows the personnel. He knows the strengths and weaknesses. Is there anything metrically that Georgia can do to try and find a way to slow down Tennessee's offense that you've seen so far this season?
Before we get to that, I think the style in the scheme is really important to mention. Right? We know Tennessee plays at this breakneck speed. They're 5th in plays per minute. Kirby Smart has been all about rotating guys in and out along the defensive front. That's what he likes to do, and he's not going to be able to do that as much here. And Brad referenced that there is some inexperience along that D-line, especially now that Nolan Smith is out, and Jalen Carter is still working his way back and going to be on a limited snap count again. And my mind immediately goes back to Georgia's spring game, where once Georgia's defensive depth was on the field, didn't show very well. The other thing relating to scheme here is we know Tennessee spread you out. Heupel's offense is very much viewed as a cheat code, right? It's similar to those Bryles, Baylor offenses that were like veer and shoot. And if you go back to week 4 against Kent State, their OC is Andrew Soder. Soder played and coached at Baylor, so he runs a nearly identical offense to Tennessee. But obviously Kent State's a MAC team, clearly outmanned. Kent State was actually successful in more than 48% of their snaps against Georgia, completed over 68% of their passes, hung 22 points. So that was really an interesting data point for me past the surface of the scoreboard when you dig into the actual matchup and scheme. Georgia has not faced many good offenses, to Brad's point. The 7 FBS offenses the Dogs have played have an average offensive efficiency rank of 52nd. And when they played Oregon, I think is really the determining factor, because if you remove Oregon from the sample, right, they're 3rd right now in schedule adjusted offense. That wasn't the offense that Georgia faced opening the season. I think Georgia has created, not enough explosive plays defensively. They're not creating a bunch of havoc. They're not getting to the quarterback, just not many negative plays. And it's a defense that's allowed some explosive runs to boot. So if you're not maybe playing that pressure style of defense, which Georgia really hasn't done over the years, that's kind of been the knock on Kirby's defense, not creating some negative plays. You can't give up the explosiveness too, right? They're 40th in schedule adjusted pass efficiency. We know what Hyatt can do. Averaging 3.8 yards per route run, leads the country in 20-plus yard touchdowns. Expect a heavier snap count for Cedric Tillman this week after, returning last week against Kentucky. I think what's interesting about this is there are some pro bettors that want to fade Tennessee, and we're certainly setting up where, the public can't get enough of the Vols. And it, again, going back to what we initially discussed, wouldn't shock me to see this become the biggest decision of the season for books to date. But after just digging into this game, I do have some questions about Georgia's defense relative to the perception and the rank. The 2 saving graces for Georgia's defense here might be that you have a veteran safety in Christopher Smith that can get everybody lined up when Tennessee's offense wants to create chaos with its tempo. And you kind of hinted at this, Todd. I'm not sure quite this is where you were going. But when we think about Kirby Smart, and the most evident example of this was last season, where Kirby learned what not to do in the national championship game against Alabama after playing them in the SEC championship game. Kirby's going to have some crib notes for this matchup against Tennessee by seeing what not to do, since his mentor, Nick Saban, who plays a very similar style of defense, just faced Tennessee a few weeks ago. Kirby's going to spend more time watching Tennessee-Alabama film from 3 weeks ago to prepare for this game than any other that he's going to look into.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the best way to go about it. I mean, when you look at Tennessee offensively, they scored 30-plus points in 11 consecutive games. It's actually the longest active streak in the SEC right now. They've scored 35-plus points in 6 consecutive games for the first time in school history. So you try and figure out, if you're Georgia, to let your guys know, hey, look, we're going to give up a big play here or there. We're not going to be able to completely clamp down on everything Tennessee wants to do. But there is no doubt that when you look at the recipe or the game plan that Nick Saban and company devised for Tennessee, it didn't work. So you can't use that as your kind of blueprint to try and slow down the Vols offensively when you look at this team and their ability to play downhill, knowing how much veteran leadership they've had and how good their offensive line has been, always something that you want working in your favor when you're talking about things trending in a positive direction in hostile territory. Now, as far as the other side of the ball is concerned, Brad, we saw Coach Stoops last week bang his head into a brick wall. Kentucky tried to take the air out of the ball, and that's great in theory until you find yourself down by multiple scores early in the game and with a quarterback that's projected by many to be a top 10 overall pick who can't throw it to receivers wearing the right colored jerseys. There were a few momentum plays early, though, that could have changed the dynamic. Either way, Tennessee was the better side. When you look at Georgia offensively, and you try and figure out where they may have difference makers, how do you assess Tennessee on the defensive side? Because as Payne referenced at the top, we all talk about Tennessee's offense and how great they've been, but I actually think Tennessee's defense this year has been a pleasant surprise.
It certainly exceeded expectations, particularly in the run game. And then last week, we mentioned how bad Tennessee has been in the pass defensively, and they shut down not me, but other draft experts, I use that in quotations, think is a top 10 quarterback. When you can't beat out Sean Clifford, I'm not sure that you should be a top 10 quarterback. But, I mean, by far their best performance of the season, pass defense last week against Kentucky. So, how does Georgia attack this Tennessee defense? I still think Georgia's going to try to run the football. I mean, that's going to play more into keeping Tennessee's offense also, off the field. The question is how. I actually think Georgia's going to have some success in that department a little bit. The question is how much success. And I think ultimately the game, everyone's going to want to talk on the other side of the ball. I think ultimately the game's won in this matchup here. And specifically, it's going to be on the shoulders of Stetson Bennett. And for me particularly, it's him avoiding turnovers. He had done that all season, had a couple of last week. We saw in bigger games and bigger moments last year, turnovers, especially against Alabama. And then we saw some nervousness, even though he's 23, 24 years old in the national title game. They had some ball security issues, at least early in that game. To me, it's almost like for Georgia, the game script is almost like a triple option type team where you can ill afford any opportunity you have to put points on the board. You have to capitalize here when you have Tennessee's offense on the other side, perfectly capable of putting points on any single possession. So can Stetson Bennett, take care of the football for an complete game here? I have my doubts, and I'm going to say, reemphasize what Payne said. I want it to. My numbers say Georgia here. I have not gotten in the window yet. I mean, normally I would be, racing with a disparity like this. But the further I dived into this matchup on both sides of the ball, I don't see a lot of it, clear-cut advantages for Georgia here on either side.
Payne, Brad mentioned Stetson Bennett, and when you look at obviously how he performed last week against Florida, that's not a Mona Lisa by any stretch of the imagination as he doubled his interception total. You look at his QBR and a lot of the other metrics don't suggest a great performance, despite Georgia winning that game by 22 points, coming up a shade short of the only number that matters, where they close as a 23-point favorite. Meanwhile, you look at Georgia's overall body of work from an efficiency standpoint. I mean, they're cranking out 7.24 yards per play. 19% of their drives have graded out explosive. I mean, more than 60% of their drives pick up 2+ first downs. The rushing success rate, tremendous. Success rates on first and second down, staying out of those third and predictable passing situations. When you look at Georgia's offense matched up against the Tennessee defense, what are you most interested to see, and what ultimately becomes the key to success for Coach Monken's offense?
Well, the first thing I'll say is last week breaking down Kentucky, Tennessee, it would have lent itself to betting Tennessee, but we were both stubborn.
I don't want to talk about it. Don't want to talk about it around here. Don't want to have to relive it. Don't want to talk about it. I went to get food at the end of that first quarter and said, I'm not watching another play in this stupid football game. Now, I didn't think Kentucky would only score 6 points. That came as a little bit of a surprise to me.
If Tennessee's pass defense plays anywhere close to how it did last week, we can just all pack it in because they're going to run the table. Right. I mean, Will Levis averaged negative 1.9 adjusted net yards per pass attempt. Maybe more bananas with the skin on dipped in mayo would rejuvenate him just a little bit more. Just a unreal game from him. And if that doesn't dock his draft status, I don't know what will. Everyone is just looking at him as if he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and we've been very hesitant the last 2 seasons, and in the biggest moment, he crapped down his leg. When I look at this, We talked about Tim Banks loving to blitz. He sent blitz last week on 42% of Levis's dropbacks, but he didn't record a single sack on those blitzes. All 4 sacks for Tennessee came from natural pressure. All 3 of Levis's interceptions came from a clean pocket. There was just, I think, a lot out there that Levis just completely missed, and I think, obviously, we've talked about Levis, and our thoughts are well into the universe at this point, but Kentucky's O-line is something we addressed last week. We thought they had some issues. They had some issues. What we've seen from Stetson Bennett since the start of this season, and even going back to last season, I think has been mostly very good. Now, there are moments where it does look like he's a little bit overwhelmed and will turn the ball over, but I think you still have to attack the same areas that we thought were a weak point for Tennessee coming into this game. I mean, the Vols, even with last week's performance, still outside the top 100 in EPA per pass allowed, outside the top 80 in explosive pass defense, and, same thing with passing success rate allowed, outside the top 80. Georgia's receiver group, though, is dinged. And I do wonder if they have the horses to kind of execute this style. I mean, Mitchell's still dealing with a high ankle sprain. He's not practicing. I think we know what Bowers, Washington, and McConkey bring to the table. But if this turns into a back-and-forth gunfight, is that enough explosiveness from those 3 guys? I think Todd Monken does a really good job disguising things. And all week, if you've listened to Tim Banks, he's talked about the Vols being disciplined with their eyes. I know Florida, without many weapons of their own, were able to score some points against the Vols because they lacked eye discipline there, and there was a lot of window dressing with motion rates and sending tight ends in different directions. And I thought they did some really smart things, Florida, there with their tight ends, and obviously Georgia has the most talented tight end crop in the entire country. Other element here is quietly Georgia's run game's improved some. O-line starting to get a little bit more push. Dewan Edwards was 3rd on the depth chart coming into the season. He's had a little bit of an emergence there and given the Dogs a bit more punch on the ground. Georgia's actually averaging 1 yard per carry more the last 3 games compared to their first 5, and I think that's a good sign here. And what was interesting is, as good as the Vols have been defensively against the run, they've actually, you go back to that first quarter, Todd, against Kentucky, the Wildcats had a 70% success rate in the opening quarter. They were able to get Chris Rodriguez going at least early. The scoreboard got so lopsided, couldn't really do it late. But that's really interesting to me, is if Georgia can get their ground game going a little bit and keep an eye on Amarius Mims. I know he got dinged up last week. Let's see if he's able to return. But there's a possibility here where Georgia is a little bit more successful on the ground than maybe the metrics would indicate. But again, just a really tough game for me because the power number indicate I should be betting Georgia here. Let's see if it gets to 7 and it kind of forces our hand. But certainly have not run to the window because I'm just not quite sure what Georgia is at this point. And they've just lost so much talent, specifically on the defensive side of the ball. It's very much impossible not to regress. And then you have Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, 2 guys that they were going to rely on mightily, are either out or playing a diminished role in terms of snap count.
And look, hey, I'm not going to sugarcoat a bad bet last week on Kentucky by any stretch of the imagination. You always look at a couple of plays and wonder if the dynamic would have been different. Tavion Robinson doesn't drop a ball on 3rd and intermediate that would have put him into plus territory. And of course, Will Levis throws that timely interception deep in Tennessee's territory, and things got out of control pretty quickly. And that's how it goes when you play a team like Tennessee that can score as quickly as they do, can put defenses constantly in conflict and get their best playmakers into wide open space. It's a credit to the scheme and everything they do. We'll see the matching of the minds with this Georgia defense against Tennessee offensively, and no doubt the college football game of the year, at least on paper, that we're all excited to watch. Later on in the evening, though, there are a couple of familiar foes that'll do battle in a showdown in the SEC West. Alabama and LSU will renew acquaintances, this time in Baton Rouge, where you're looking at Alabama right around a 13-point road favorite in this spot. One shop out to 13.5. Total in this game sits at 58. And Alabama, they've beaten LSU in 10 out of 11. Their only loss came during LSU's national championship run back in 2019. LSU looking to win back-to-back games versus top 10 teams for the first time since they won the national title back in 2019. Nick Saban, 12-4 versus LSU as Alabama head coach. And when you look at Nick Saban, he has beaten Brian Kelly in their 2 previous head-to-head matchups when Kelly was, of course, on the sidelines for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. As far as Brian Kelly, I think he's had, one of the best quotes, and it's one that I like not only in this situation, but in general, talking about this matchup. It's not pressure, it's a privilege. It's why I came to LSU to play in games like this. And you wonder if that's the kind of mentality that this entire LSU football team has adopted as their mantra going forward. Brad, we saw LSU struggle early in the year. They looked ill-equipped to slow down some elite offenses. No greater illustration than against the aforementioned Tennessee Volunteers while they were blitzed right from the opening kickoff. But over the last couple of weeks, LSU offensively has looked as dynamic as we could have anticipated with huge performances against Florida. It is what it is. But against Ole Miss, not only do they look great on the offensive side, but they really clamped down defensively after the Rebels had some success early. And the big reason for that, Jaden Daniels not turning over the football, proving himself to be a true dual threat quarterback. When you look at LSU, you can put your Brian Kelly disdain off to the side, at least for this particular breakdown. Have you been surprised at how LSU has taken a Kelly scheme, putting themselves in position at number 10 in the college football playoff, to some extent to control their own destiny, to get to the college football playoff and maybe even win the SEC West?
Certainly, especially when you just go back a few weeks. I know it seems like an eternity ago, but that first half against Auburn on the road and the inability of LSU to pretty much do anything against, what now has become a pretty bad Auburn team. You can make a case, at least on the offense side of the ball, that they're as improved as any team in the country. Now, I do question the quality of opposition that they faced as far as Florida and Ole Miss, but you cannot deny the talent of Jaden Daniels, who, we question maybe durability. Obviously had some decision-making issues last year at Arizona State, although he didn't as a younger player, and he's kind of reverted back to that. And he takes care of the football. And the surprising thing for me is how much they rely on Jaden Daniels running the ball. I mean, he's by far their leading rusher. And I said even in their struggles early in the season, their best offensive play seemed to be a Jaden Daniels scramble on 3rd and long. Now he's added a little bit more of the pass game. We saw a couple games ago Keishawn Boutte get involved finally for the first time this season against Florida. And when you got a guy that's only thrown one interception, he's completing 70%, and he's leading your team in rushing. I mean, to me, that especially in a conference and the schedule that they played, that says Jaden Daniels is playing like a top 10, borderline top 5 quarterback in the country. And when you take that under consideration, you shouldn't be surprised to see LSU here, with a chance to win the West Division here as we enter November.
I mean, it's amazing. You mentioned Jaden Daniels, and we look at what he's done so far this season, and I think it just further illustrates the damage that Herm Edwards and that coaching staff at Arizona State did to anything that they put their fingers on. Because when you look at Jaden Daniels, 12 passing touchdown, 1 interception this season, compared to last year where he had a 10 touchdown to 10 interception ratio, 11 touchdowns and 0 turnovers over this 2-game winning streak, and the 45 points that LSU has scored in each of the last 2 games, the first time since they've done that in consecutive games since Joe Burrow was at the helm. You've seen the improvement, Payne, as far as LSU's EPA on the offensive side. Is there a path to success for LSU offensively matched up against this Alabama defense?
Let's see what Brian Kelly comes up with out of the bye. I'm sure there'll be a little more creativity. There's probably a little bit more thrown on Jaden Daniels' plate, right? This is a brand new system for him. The bye week probably came at a good time because you see Daniels' confidence growing, and now we can put more on his plate. But Brian Kelly runs a pro-style offense, and traditionally those haven't given Saban much trouble, right? And it's why Saban dominated Brian Kelly's offenses at Notre Dame, in addition to the talent gap. And I think in year 1 at LSU, there's still that same level of talent gap. We have seen real improvement from LSU's offense the last few weeks, and you guys referenced Keishawn Boutte. Somehow Brian Kelly's, at least for the moment, got him to re-buy in. Now, Jaden Daniels being more decisive in getting the ball out quicker, that's something that Brian Kelly talked about for a few weeks. We're starting to see it unfold, and you can see the efficiency increase here. Right, when Jaden Daniels throws in under 2.5 seconds, the adjusted accuracy is 84%. When he holds on to it, pats it, overthinks, gets it out late, 71% adjusted accuracy. I think what is interesting, though, if you look at Alabama, traditionally, you go back to like the Johnny Manziel years, and you're like, they have trouble with mobile quarterbacks. This season so far, I think they've done a pretty good job keeping mobile quarterbacks in check. That is obviously a big part of Jaden Daniels' game, as Brad mentioned, but Bama held KJ Jefferson to just 1.7 predicted points added as a runner. Hendon Hooker just 2.5. So Alabama's faced some mobile quarterbacks this season, and they held their own in some of those spots in regards to at least controlling the quarterback ground game. I'm not sure how LSU protects. I know Will Anderson isn't having the season he did a year ago, right? But he's still a 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps this year. You still have Dallas Turner and Braswell. They're both over double-digit percentage mark as well. LSU right now outside the top 100 in schedule adjusted havoc allowed and sack rate allowed. Alabama also made some changes after Tennessee lit them up through the air. Eli Ricks was inserted into the starting lineup. He allowed 19 yards on 9 targets and broke up 4 passes against Mississippi State. Obviously, Eli Ricks is a former LSU transfer. You know this is a game he's looked forward to. And if you look at how the defense is structured a little bit now in the back, you get Rick starting opposite of Kool-Aid. It allows Saban to move Teron Arnold around a little bit. Arnold was recruited as a safety. He was playing corner, a little bit out of position. It's a tough transition there. But now you can play Terrion in the slot as a third, as the nickel corner there. You can play him at safety. He can play in the slot a little bit. I just think this gives Bama a little bit more depth and versatility in their back end. I don't see a path to a slew of points here for LSU, honestly.
And if they're going to struggle to score, that could be a bit problematic because for all the success that LSU has had in recent weeks, it's been attributed to an offense putting up points in bunches. It hasn't been because their defense has suddenly become a brick wall. Now matched up against an Alabama offense that's still 5th best in the country in net available yards so far this season. They're 4th in points per game, 9th in yards per play, 1st in yards per carry. Brad, when you assess Bryce Young's performance, we knew it was going to be tough for him to replicate what we saw a season ago. He doesn't clearly have the weapons on the outside. But as far as Alabama offensively, have you seen them make positive strides and reason for optimism that this team is going to be able to move the football with relative ease against LSU's defense?
It's a good question. From Bryce Young, absolutely. I mean, considering that he doesn't have the wide receiver group that, Jalen Hurts and Tua Tagovailoa had for several years there, I mean, I've been impressed. I mean, the game that you guys were at, I mean, I tweeted this during the game. I mean, Bryce Young to me looks clearly like the best player in college football. I mean, the plays that he makes, I mean, he bails. He is the sole reason, in my opinion, why Alabama hasn't lost, an extra game or two each of the last couple of seasons. With that being said, I mean, there's some limits here on the skill position on the outside. They go out in the transfer portal. They get a guy from Louisville that was supposed to take the top off defense as a speedster. Hasn't been healthy all year. That hurt him. Obviously, one of their top wide receivers transfers to Georgia. Or Georgia, he comes in from Georgia, I should say, and he hasn't lived up to expectations. And Jermaine Burton, to me, I thought the fix that was easy was to get more touches to obviously Gibbs from Georgia Tech. It happened, and then the Mississippi State game happened, and all of a sudden, scoreboard looks good for Alabama. They cover what I thought was an inflated point spread, but you start diving into that game, and obviously Bryce Young makes a highlight Heisman caliber type, touchdown pass early in the game, but Alabama can't run the football at all. 29 rushing yards, and I just there's too much inconsistencies for me outside of Bryce Young to rely on this, to put my fist on the table and say, yep, I've seen it. That's the Alabama offense that I was expecting this year. And some of it also has to do with the inconsistencies on the offensive line, particularly on the road. I mean, a lot of Alabama's pre-snap penalties is that offensive line unit. And obviously you're talking Death Valley at night with a team that, thinks they can compete with Alabama. So how does that get cleared up? It certainly didn't get cleared up after the Texas game. We saw just as many, if not more, pre-snap penalties in the Tennessee game. So I have my worries. Bryce Young's the least worry that I have as far as Alabama's offense. It's just everybody around him, including the offensive play calling under Bill O'Brien.
Yeah, and you know what, Brad, you mentioned it, and Nick Saban wasn't shying away from that in one of his pressers earlier this week, talking about how they needed to be more diverse offensively when it came to running the football and execute a little better. So you wonder with the bye week, Payne talked about Brian Kelly putting in some wrinkles, what that could mean for Bill O'Brien and how this Alabama attack looks. But I think you highlighted an excellent point there, talking about the lack of discipline that we've seen from Alabama multiple times when they go on the road. No greater illustration than the 17 accepted penalties against Tennessee Tennessee. You mentioned it against Texas early in the year, and in week 2 against Texas, you go, okay, they're going to clean this up. Things are going to improve, but this is hostile territory again. Payne, if you're sitting in that offensive film room all week long trying to figure out the best approach for attacking this LSU defense, is it a steady dose of Jahmyr Gibbs, or would that do a disservice to your most talented player in Bryce Young, who you know is the consummate floor general?
I think you guys have covered this perfectly because it's Death Valley at night, and let's not forget, could be a little wet there. So you have some variance elements there, but recently Nick Saban's been really able to focus his guys in more when playing LSU on the road than when at home when you compare performance versus expectation. This side of the ball is simple for me, and I think you guys hinted at it and covered it and grazed over it a little bit here. But to me, it's can LSU's defense win on early downs and stop the run well enough to where its pass rush can get after an Alabama offensive line with some question marks. And you got to get Bryce Young where he's not throwing from standard downs. You have to get LSU's defense in a spot where we know it's a passing down, because if Bryce Young is able to throw from standard downs where LSU has to defend run or pass, LSU's secondary is going to get shredded. And from what we've seen, right, the 8 data points we have, I'm not sure LSU can stop the run well enough. And I know Tigers fans listening to this will say, well, we stopped Ole Miss on the ground. Sure. Jackson Dart was less than 100%, and Zach Evans didn't play. To this point, when you adjust for schedule, LSU's run defense is outside the top 90 in EPA per rush, outside the top 90 in rushing success rate allowed. And so if LSU can't stop the run, you're not going to be in enough situations where the likes of, B.J. Ojolari and Harold Perkins and Wingo and Ali Gay can just get upfield without having to think about the run. And that's what you have to have happen, because Alabama's outside the top 70 in passing down sack rate allowed. So if you can get them in known passing situations, it allows the best component of LSU's defense to protect its worst component on the back end. And it very much is going to work in unison like that. If you're watching this game and it looks like LSU's able to stop the run a little bit, might be a decent time to maybe fire in a live bet, because at that point you're going to get Bama in some situations that are known, and then the pass rush can get after him. I think we know Bama's receiver group isn't what it's been in years past. We've kind of called that from the onset of the season. But I will say this, we started to see the unit come together just a little bit, and players are having a little bit more clearly defined roles. And I think the bye week's only going to help that. Ja'Cory Brooks is clearly Alabama's downfield weapon. Kobe Prentice has kind of come on and is formed into their slot guy, and Trayshawn Holden's that big body guy who can go up and get a ball. We saw JoJo early return from injury, and Tyler Harrell is going to have specific roles created for him after the bye, is my understanding. Finally got on the field pre-bye. And I'm hearing that he could be implemented a little bit more in some specific sets. This is not an elite Bama receiver group right now. We know that. But my sense is the stock arrow is pointing up a little bit.
Last question I have for you guys, and I don't care which of one of you wants to take it, who wants to start, if only one of you wants to comment. When you look at the number right now and where the market sits, do we think we see more Alabama money come in driving this to 14, or is this the perfect price to create two-way action, which will inevitably be one of the marquee games Saturday night?
I'll let Brod take that.
I anticipate, we've already seen a few ticks on Alabama. I think it's far more likely to go to 14 than go down. And one of the big reasons why on Sunday I bet Alabama laid 12. Just simple for me. Even though my power ratings didn't necessarily scream value on Alabama, I just thought far more likely this line goes to 14 than down to 10. Let me bet now and enter the market now, and I'll figure out what I want to do later in the week.
I initially leaned LSU, and then when I dug into the matchup, I didn't necessarily love it. And so I think we might hang here at 13.5 would be my vibe.
No, fair assessment. I just was kind of curious, as we talk all the time about our listeners that we know will most likely want to get involved in this game in some capacity, about how they should try and enter the market. Sounds buy it. If you like Alabama, maybe lay the 13. Not going to move that much against you to a key number. If you like the dog, wait it out. You won't lose that much value if it were happen to fall a tick below. Remember, guys, you can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me on social media, and most importantly, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. One final game to get to, gents, and it is in South Bend Saturday evening. The Clemson Tigers come a-calling, and you're looking at Clemson as a road favorite. The market fascinating on this game because you do have the opportunity opportunity to lay 3 with Clemson at one shop. You have an opportunity to take 4 with the Irish at a heck of a lot more. Both teams enter the game fresh off wins against Syracuse, Clemson off the bye, Notre Dame having done their damage on the road last week, got an early pick 6, and used that to roll downhill. Rushing for 200 yards has kind of been the benchmark for the Irish, something that they've accomplished 113 times since 1996, winning 103 games with that the case. When you look at Clemson, they haven't had it happen against them all that often, but it did earlier this year against Florida State. The last time the Irish hosted an AP top 5 team, they defeated number 1 Clemson 47-40 behind 140 yards and 3 touchdowns from now current Los Angeles Ram Kyron Williams. Clemson seeking their first 9-0 start since the 2019 season and 5th under Dabo Swinney. They went to the national championship game in each of the 4 years where they did start 9-0. Meanwhile, Clemson, a 12-game win streak versus unranked teams, the last loss coming in double overtime back in 2021. And here comes Notre Dame, 3-0 ATS this year. Very limited sample size, obviously, against AP-ranked opponents. 2-1 straight up. They lost the season opener against Ohio State. They beat a ranked BYU team, something that wouldn't happen now given what we've seen from the Cougars, and then followed it up with one of their more complete efforts last week against Syracuse. But Brad, the biggest question I have for you, and I think it's the one that all Irish fans have asked each and every week they watch this football team, if Clemson can stop the run, do you have any confidence whatsoever that Drew Pine can do what may be asked of him in potential inclement weather to throw the football and keep Clemson's defense somewhat off balance?
No, I don't. And that's I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I mean, especially what I've seen the last 3 games compared to the first 3 starts for Drew Pine. First 3 starts, I mean, was playing at a good level. I mean, to say the least, 74% completion percentage, 8 touchdowns, 1 interception. Looked like he was even an improvement over Tyler Buckner. Last 3 starts, once they've gotten film on Drew Pine and what Tommy Rees and the offense's game plan has been under Pine and how it's changed compared to what it was the first couple games of the season, I mean, completing less than 50% of his passes. He's not played any team in the same stratosphere as what he'll see, at least from that Clemson front 7. I mean, we're talking UNLV, Stanford, who would really poor defense. And then obviously Syracuse, who a little bit banged up, obviously, on the defense side of the ball. Less than 50% completions. So, no. I mean, I expect, obviously, the game plan to be pretty simple for Clemson. Put as many guys in the box as you can. Notre Dame's very limited at wide receiver as far as being able to beat you over the top. I mean, it's a big reason why Notre Dame's number 120 in the country in marginal explosiveness. This is a team that I think, Clemson can play press man coverage, load guys in the box, force Drew Pine to beat them, and I have serious doubts on whether Drew Pine can do that.
Payne, the one matchup you're looking for that you think will define the outcome between Clemson and Notre Dame Saturday night?
Just, we've seen this for the last few weeks now. There is clearly one specific bettor that values Notre Dame more than most.
Brad's here. He can defend himself. You don't have to, throw veiled shots in his general direction, Payne.
So anytime this has gotten to 4.5, that gentleman has stepped in. So there is a little bit of a battle here. Now, when I look at Clemson, DJU's had an extra week off the bye to decompress and regroup after the Syracuse turnover fest. And this really does come down to the same things that we've discussed about Notre Dame the last few weeks. And I think with the potential of 21-mile-per-hour winds and a little rain, those areas of concern intensify. Right? Offensively, the only way Notre Dame can survive is by punching you in the mouth, being more physical and running the ball. Clemson's obviously had some struggles in that department relative to what we expected from that defensive line against Syracuse. More than 52% of runs gained 5+ yards. Problem is Sean Tucker only carried it 5 times. Syracuse O-line actually created 2.1 yards per rush before first contact. Go back the week prior, something we touched on in the Florida State game, a far less than 100% healthy Seminoles offensive line created more than 2.6 yards before first contact, and 56% of FSU's runs gained 5+ yards on Clemson. So that is truly the only path for Notre Dame offensively. On the other side of the ball, same thing, right? I've been saying Notre Dame's defense, led by a defensive-minded head coach in Marcus Freeman, has been living a little bit of a lie. You can absolutely bully Notre Dame's defense in the trenches. And heck, we saw Marshall do it. UNLV ran at an efficiency rate above expectation. Notre Dame's defense right now, when adjusting for schedule, outside the top 100 in rushing success rate allowed, yards per rush allowed, and EPA per rush allowed. So the trench battle on both sides of the line favor Clemson. That, again, is going to become, really important when weather's in the mix. So Brad's going to be buying us drinks if the real Clemson defensive line stands up, and I'm rooting for him. That is why I saw a posted ticket. I'm sure there's a bevy of other tickets on Clemson as well this week, so I am certainly rooting for him.
Should be an interesting game. And Brad, I guess the last thing that I'll ask on this, when you look at Notre Dame's upcoming schedule past the game against Clemson, what do you need to see from the Irish, more as a fan than as a sports bettor, to define this season as a success?
Oh, wow. It's actually off the field. I need Marcus Freeman and company to hold on to a recruiting class that's number 3 in the country right now. And to me, whether this season, to me, obviously, and look, I had lower expectations. I mean, I bet under the season win total, and I was called an idiot for betting under 9. I could kind of see this happening. First year coach, first time starting quarterback, even if it was going to be Buckner, and a lot of other question marks on the team that I didn't think Brian Kelly did a good job of recruiting. Some deficiencies in the secondary at wide receiver and whatnot. So to me, it's all off the field. It's holding on to recruiting class, and also going out in the transfer portal and getting a legitimate starting quarterback for 2023. But that's pretty much all I care about as a Notre Dame fan moving forward, at least the next 3-4 months.
Boys, I don't say this often because I don't need any sort of praise to go to either of your head, but you guys did a hell of a job navigating through some of the biggest matchups that we have. Not like you don't always do a great job around here. Every single week we break down the games, but I feel like we covered a tremendous amount of ground with some of the marquee programs, some of the biggest games, and obviously the biggest game that we've seen so far in college football 2022 between Georgia and Tennessee. So I wanted to give either of you the opportunity, if there was anything that we left out for the games that we covered or any other nuggets you wanted to share before we bid you, Brad, a fond farewell until we reconvene next Wednesday.
I like to joke around a little bit. I got nothing this week. Payne wishes me luck in the Notre Dame Clemson game. I'm betting against the Irish, and I'm going to reciprocate that, and I'm going to root for a Florida State blowout. So all love this week.
Look at this kumbaya shit. We're going to have to put an end to this for next week. So I need you guys to come in bringing bullets, ready to throw haymakers, whether it's at me or whether it's at each other. If we all hold hands and dance around in a circle, I'm not sure that's what our listeners are grown accustomed to.
Well, I know you like to, this is probably your favorite part of the show, where you just throw out a little jab and hope that some haymakers
No,
get thrown.
I'm not throwing any today.
Just
I gave
maybe
you guys a compliment.
before the end of the season. No, that's what I'm saying. You roll the ball out and just hope that 2 alligators attack each other. But I think ultimately, it's a long season. There might be a little teamed up effort at some point against one.
Yeah,
Todd
well, I
Herman.
figure I had it coming in some capacity. I mean, this is what happens when you're, theoretically a coach or a facilitator of an AAU team and you surround yourself with talent. You just roll the ball out there and you kick your feet up on the bench and allow you guys to do work. Kind of what Jim Boeheim has done at Syracuse, Payne, over the last 4 or 5 seasons.
Well, it's good now that you realized you can't play, that you've gravitated towards coach. You have very much Jim Carrey, cable guy, basketball vibes.
Those who can't play, coach. Let that always be a friendly reminder. Always surround yourself with smart people that help elevate you. And on that note, Brad, before Payne decides to really get into the muck, he can take shots one-on-one at me. Appreciate the time, contributions every single week. Best of luck with all of your myriad of plays this coming weekend in college football.
As always, thank you, guys. Talk to you next week.
Now you boys have me nervous. I mean, I've been waiting for shots to come in my general direction. They haven't been here. Brad and I have ganged up on you. You and I have ganged up on him with the Kim Kardashian stuff, which, by the way, he owes us a relationship update to see if they've made it to their 3rd date. I mean, clearly she's not going back to Kanye at this point, so Brad's got much better chance and dating prospects there. But I'll be waiting. I know it's coming, and I figure I've been owed that working on a little bit of borrowed time.
And Giselle is clearly in the market now. So we'll see what transpires for Brad. Having a good college football season, I think that's probably the way you slide into the DMs.
I mean,
the guy's check out my record, baby.
Guy's got 700 college football win totals that I'm sure he's going to have a lot of discretionary income when all those things turn into winners at the end of the year. So as always, we appreciate Brad's contributions. He has been a massive get for us to take this podcast to another level. Last weekend, though, Payne, we found our way into the winner's circle with what I would define as a rocking chair winner. Eli Drinkowitz doing the Lord's work, getting Missouri not only the cover in Columbia, South Carolina, but winning that football game outright, despite them not really doing much in the second half. Brady Cook, forever we will trust going forward. As far as investment opportunities this weekend, college football week 10, where are you taking us on this magical mystery tour?
Horns up, baby. Let's go with rotation number 357, the Texas Longhorns visiting Kansas State. Let's lay the short road price here of 2.5. What's interesting to me about this, when we think about perception and point spread value, I'm much higher on Texas than ultimately I think the rest of the market, because this is a team that could easily be undefeated. And they went in to Oklahoma State, I thought dominated that game. Oklahoma State had the benefit of the whistle. Oklahoma State had the benefit of turnover luck. And then you kind of just flip to last week where Kansas State comes out like a house on fire, but we know Oklahoma State was down 6 starters. Their starting quarterback, a shell of himself, dealing with some injuries himself. And so I think you get some value in this. Texas coming off the bye, going to have a couple of wrinkles up their sleeve with Sark. This feels like a turning point for their program as well. You come off the bye, you're 5-3, you should be better. And ultimately, if you drop this game and go to 5-4, some questions start to come about. I think they're able to do a decent job stopping the ground game. When you look at rushing success rate, Texas top 12 in the country by our metrics and schedule adjusted run defense there. You know Deuce Vaughn is going to be implemented in this game. And then you talk about the quarterback situation for Kansas State. Is it going to be Will Howard? Is it going to be Adrian Martinez? The quote coming out of Kansas State from just yesterday, Todd, was Will Howard, clearly the healthiest quarterback in that room for Kansas State, and it's much easier to play when you have a lead like they did last week. But we referenced some of those numbers on our preview of Oklahoma State, Kansas State last week. And when Will Howard's had a large enough sample size, he hasn't played overly well. And so I just think we're catching Texas here at the right time at a short price. And so we'll go ahead and lay it on the road at anything under a field goal. Right now, 2.5, the consensus number.
Health this time of year is vastly overrated. I mean, I've been podcasting since the start of the season with a bum hip that I got to get up, move around a little bit, keep this thing loose. I haven't yet busted out the heating pad, but I think as we get into the dog days in November, the weather cools down around here. This is what happens when you're an old man on the wrong side of 40, Payne. Eventually you'll get there, but I know that you're only inching towards your 30th birthday, so you got plenty of time to catch up.
Yeah, you just keep applying enough eye cream and you never get into the 30s. That's my philosophy.
Yeah, well, I mean, most people don't have the budget you do allocated for eye cream to try and keep those wrinkles away. I mean, people don't spend that on a monthly grocery bill like what you have to spend to keep your face looking young and youthful over there.
All right. Texas Longhorns this week. Let's get to the window.
All right.
And keep the streak running.
All right. Anything else that you want to share with our loyal listeners? Do you want to take shots? Do you
back in 24 hours for the NFL podcast for NFL Week 9? Let's get out of Dodge.
I can't wait for a Miami Dolphins draft capital trade rant tomorrow morning at this same time to hear what your sentiments are about that. But as always, you can follow Brad Powers on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there. I keep saying at Payne Insider. I think it's just at Payne now. We've gone to just the one name for ease of location through social media. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. Best of luck with all of your college football investments this weekend, and with a Texas ticket in hand, hopefully we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.